I think this is really interesting and timely because for anyone who's on any of the NMLA lists, you will know that just last night at the Rio Rancho Library Board meeting, 4 members of groups that want to ban books actually spoke up at the library and requested that LGBTQ and probably other related materials be removed from the Rio Rancho Library. And fortunately, 28 members of the public spoke up in defense of maintaining those materials, and including the state senator, whose name I wrote down, State Senator McKenna spoke up in favor of maintaining the collection as it stands. So we're getting you guys at a really, really timely moment in New Mexico, and of course in the rest of the country. So thank you, Val Nye, and you said you didn't introduce the rest of your team. So just thank you for coming here to talk about intellectual freedom challenges, how they have affected your libraries, your communities, and you personally, which, you know, the ImagineIF library was certainly an issue there. So thanks again, and go ahead, Val.
All right, thank you. It's really great to be able to talk to you today. I do think this is a really important time to be addressing these issues. I'm going to switch to showing my screen, and I think I will lose the ability to see most things in Zoom. So if something comes up, if one of the guides can let me know through the audio, that would be great. But we will have plenty of time for questions at the end, and we really want to hear from you all and hear your experiences. So my name is Valerie Nye. For those of you who don't know me, I am the library director at Santa Fe Community College, and I'm honored to be joined today by 2 librarians. Tom Taylor is from Kansas, from the Andover Public Library in Kansas. And Sean Anderson, I don't think has joined us yet, but he is coming to us from Montana. He was the associate director at the ImagineIF library, and will be sharing his very recent experience with issues that have happened there. Both of their stories are really important. Tom's story is actually in a book that I edited a couple years ago, and so you can read about it in more detail in the book. Sean's story is much more recent. I met Sean last summer at the Mountain Plains Library Association in Montana. So I'm grateful they're both here or going to be here joining me today. And I'll do this one more time before I switch to presenter, to sharing my screen. This is a link to additional information about our presentation. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things, and we'll be able to point you to this page. If there are things that we talk about that aren't there, I'll add them later. But right now, the things we're planning to talk about will be on that page. So for the last 15 years, I've been talking about intellectual freedom issues with libraries. And one of the common occurrences that happens, especially when I'm presenting in person, is that people will come up after the presentation and share a story with me. And often it's a sad and very stressful story. Sometimes really good things happen. But what I've learned from these presentations and talking to librarians is that challenges are always personal, they are always difficult, and they always require support. And this is a screenshot I got from the Rio Rancho Public Library discussion that did happen last night. It was a packed city council meeting from what I could tell. There's been the formation of an activist group in Rio Rancho. There were a lot of amazing and eloquent speakers who spoke on behalf of the Rio Rancho Public Library, including parents, students, politicians. It was a really great turnout. And from what I understand is the library had very little time to bring people together. So of course, we'll continue to follow what's happening with them and support them, but it sounds like their community has some amazing support. So because of the stories that I was hearing, and I was doing a lot of presenting with my friend and colleague, Kathy Barco, we decided to collect the stories, and we published a book, True Stories of Censorship Battles in America's Libraries. And then around 2016, I thought it was time to do an update to that because the landscape of challenges had changed a lot. So I published a book with ALA that came out in March of 2020 called Intellectual Freedom Stories from a Shifting Landscape. And that's the book that Tom's story is in. So between the two books, there are over 30 stories, and we have really created these books to be tools, and each story and chapter has a set of discussion questions following the story. So they're meant to be stories that we can engage with and talk about in really specific ways related to our personal knowledge about our libraries and what's going on in our communities. So since the Intellectual Freedom from a Shifting Landscape book came out, things have changed really dramatically. The landscape has continued to shift, and I have wondered about our profession and have feared that there are a lot of broken things in our profession. Librarians are being personally threatened. Great people are leaving our profession because of these threats to themselves, to their families, to their libraries. And over the past 2 years, I have found myself discouraged. But I think the stories that we tell are the important aspect of what we have going for us. And so instead of thinking of our stories as broken pieces of pottery, I've started to think of ourselves as a more beautiful pot. And our stories are the gold that brings the pieces together. So this is the way we can come together. The stories have given me so much to think about. And as I put together the Intellectual Freedom from a Shifting Landscape book, I was lucky enough to find a librarian named Janice Del Negro, who wrote the preface for the book. And she's an associate professor at the Graduate School of Library and Information Science at Dominican in River Forest, Illinois. And she is a librarian, but she also studies storytelling. And her research is about how we hear stories and what our brain does when we hear a story. And this is a quote from her preface, that stories are ways that human beings make sense of the world. And Janice has based her work on storytelling on the research conducted by a scientist named Yuri Hassan, who is currently a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton. And what he's doing is using fMRIs, or functional MRIs, to map the brain and what happens to our brain when we hear a story. And so this is a quote from some of his research, that storytelling is something that humans do on a daily basis. And from what he's been able to tell, looking at the functional MRIs, is the patterns are really complex, and how we understand each other and things that are happening in our world is really dependent on the stories we hear and the stories we tell. And this is one more quote from him. Through stories, you're going to understand me better. You're going to have familiar feelings to the feelings I'm having, and you're going to remember it better. And his scientific work really shows how brains synchronize during storytelling, and how even people coming from very different places, once they start to engage in storytelling and listening, that our brains start to operate in a similar way. And again, this has been seen because of the new functional MRI technology that's available and affordable for scientists. So going back to Janice, she's also really interested in intellectual freedom and how stories influence intellectual freedom. And so her quote is, "Telling stories that illustrate what intellectual freedom is and why it matters helps strengthen the necessary trust between the library and the community." So telling stories to our patrons and understanding those stories is a really key way to connect with our community. Intellectual freedom is a difficult concept to understand until it's hitting you right between the eyes, essentially. So being able to tell stories and share information with people who may not fully understand intellectual freedom issues and libraries is an important aspect of education. So in that vein, I'm going to pass this on to Tom Taylor, who is going to share his very personal story about a situation he encountered in his library in Kansas. So welcome, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. I'm not sure. I guess you can't see me. Maybe you can.
I can see you.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
All right. Good. Well, I guess that's good. Anyway, thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I was talking to some of my colleagues not too long after the challenge in my library, and they said, "We're glad it was you that happened to. We don't want to do it, and now you can help us." And I thought, oh, great. But really, the story I have to tell is pre-pandemic, and it's kind of, the challenges have just skyrocketed since then. But I think what went on in Andover, Kansas, is what's going on across the country. I just want to start off by saying Andover is an affluent suburb of Wichita. People move here for the schools. There are a lot of churches, but the people are also highly educated. So it's a lot of, I would say, economic conservatives, but not necessarily political ones. And you each have your own communities, and what goes in your libraries a lot of times is a reflection of your community. Well, in the summer of 2018, I received a request from a woman to meet with me and her friend. They had some concerns about some of the books in our children's department. That's all they told me. I wasn't sure what was coming. So what I did was I got out our library policies and procedures that dealt with intellectual freedom, with material selection, and then with the challenging procedure that we have, as well as in our policy manual, we reference the freedom to read statement by the American Library Association, and among other things. So I had printed all of that out, hoping to head off any concerns. I got in the meeting, and the two women were very cordial, and they brought these three books out: George by Alex Gino, I Am Jazz by Jazz Jennings, and it's a picture book, so it has an illustrator as well, and then Lily and Duncan by Donna Gephardt. Their concerns about these books were that these books featured transgendered characters, main characters, and they felt that the books were encouraging or promoting a transgender lifestyle. So I said, all right, I'll read these books and write you a letter about them. Now, George by Alex Gino is it's now called Melissa. The main character is in grade school. She was born with the name George, given the name George at birth, but George felt like she was a girl. And it centers around the struggle that George has to get the play in their school play. They're doing Charlotte's Web, and she wants to be Charlotte. And teachers originally discouraged that. That's a female role. And it goes through the struggle of this young person. Now, I didn't originally read this book because it was on the Kansas William Allen White recommended books list for that year. William Allen White Award is given annually to books for children's literature. It's the state award. And this was on the short list for the award winners. The people that vote for these books are school librarians, principals, and English teachers in schools. So I thought they vetted this book. I'm not going to read it. But then I read I Am Jazz and Lillian Duncan. I Am Jazz it's a biographical picture book about Jazz Jennings. And I wasn't familiar with Jazz Jennings, but Jazz had a reality TV show that dealt about her life living as a transgendered young woman. And then Jazz later wrote a book herself, and you can get that in audio or print. But this is a beautiful picture book. The illustrations are gorgeous, and it basically details Jazz's transition from a boy to a girl. The third book is Lillian Duncan by Donna Gephardt, and it features two main characters, Lily, who is a transgendered middle schooler, and then her friend Duncan, also a middle schooler. Duncan has bipolar disorder, and then Lily, of course, is transitioning. And it's a story of their friendship and the challenges that they face. I really enjoyed it. It's a really good book. I've recommended it to people. So what I did was I wrote letters, and I described why I thought these books were in the right location. As you know, books have an intended audience, and children read up. So high schoolers are not going to want to read a book about middle schoolers. That's why Lillian Duncan recommended it stayed in the juvenile fiction section, which is kind of geared to, from early readers all the way up to sort of 6th, 7th grade readers. We have a separate young adult section, and then of course an adult section. That was the target demographic. And I Am Jazz is, like I said, it looks like a picture book, and that the intended audience for that was young people. And I did not think these books need to be moved. If they're moved, they just sort of get buried and then lost. People wouldn't find them unless they were, using a card catalog. But that's not how it is. And so what I did was I pulled up reviews of each of the book from sources like School Library Journal, Kirkus Reviews, and a few others. And I had all of those sources that I included in the letter. And then I made a list of other libraries in the state of Kansas that had these books in their collection and what collection they were in. That was really helpful. These were not, distinct titles to the Andover Public Library. They were found throughout the state, especially George. I had hoped that would be the end of it. I did a big information dump on these people, my policies with the letter, with these reviews. I did describe our policies for reconsideration of removal materials. I thought it was behind me, then I got a letter, and it was the challenge form. We had a specific form, and it asks, what is the book you want that you're concerned about? Did you read it in its entirety? What was the problem in the book, and do you have recommendations for something else? And and it also asked how you were aware of this book. So I lumped all these three together because the only challenge is that they're featuring transgendered young people, and they believe that there's a transgender agenda, and that they also cited things from various doctors that transitional drugs are bad, and that young children cannot know they're trans. That's not the case, and those are like a minority opinion of doctors. I think it's in the upper 90% of doctors that have debunked that theory. But That's what they were riding on. I was expecting that they were going to use religion, as what would be the objection to transgendered kids, but they didn't. They used this sort of pseudoscience. Another thing about the objection is they said they found out about these books through a podcast. They didn't identify which one, but it was through a podcast. And so listening to that podcast, mentioned these books, they went to our catalog, found them, checked them out, read them, and proceeded with the challenge. Oh, okay, what was our next step? What's our policy? Well, we form a committee to evaluate the books and decide whether or not they stay in the collection or get removed. Myself, I was on the committee. Our children's librarian was on the committee. Then we had one person from our library board on the committee and another person from the general public in our committee. We chose a parent of younger children. And then the person who wrote the challenge could appoint someone to serve on that committee. And she appointed her friend that was with us in those meetings. So all of our committee members had to read all 3 books. So I did read George. I mean, it took me 2 or 3 hours, and the others read them. Then we gathered for a meeting, and that would have been in December of 2018 when we had our meeting, and we voted 4-5 to keep the books in the collection. Now, I wrote that letter stating that our policy allowed for a final appeal to the board of directors. Now, admittedly, it was around the holiday time that they got the letter. Again, it seemed like that issue had been put to rest. I was hoping not to deal with that anymore, but the challenger did want to appeal to the library board. So we had our January board meeting where we had an open forum that people were invited to attend and speak. But the challenger, they gave her 30 minutes, or she took 35 minutes and went through her points and her, why she was having a challenge. Well, the room was full. We had an idea that we might be expecting a large group, so we moved it to our large meeting room, but it was packed. Of course, this is, pre-pandemic, so there was no social distancing, but it was crowded. It had gotten leaked to a local transgendered rights group, and they showed up. A lot of them showed up, as well as the people that wanted this book banned. And we heard from a variety of people. Most of them did not live in the city of Andover. A few did. One who did was a medical doctor who lived in Andover, and she mentioned how that this was quoting scientists doctors who, in some senses, you could even be considered a hate group. So our board listened to all of this and then closed the session. There was actually a newspaper reporter from the Wichita Eagle there in the room, and there was a television news interview of myself that was done that week, separate from the meeting. Well, the board announced, hey, we'll make our ruling in the following month in our February board meeting. Later that week, the Wichita Eagle, the news reporter, wrote his release. It made the Wichita paper. It was big news. And then it hit the AP, the Associated Press. And once it hit the Associated Press, it spread really fast. It was listed in newscasts and newspapers across the country. It made Library Journal, among other things. I had obviously not anticipated that it would be so overwhelming, but I did reach out to the American Library Association, and I didn't mention that earlier. I'd reached out to them prior to this, as well as like the Kansas Library Association, and I talked to some colleagues that in the area that had dealt with a similar thing. So I had a lot of help. From like the Coalition Against Censorship, and the Because Jazz, I Am Jazz is a picture book. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund was involved, and that's an organization I've been really fond of for years. So it was really neat working with all these people and getting things shared around. Well, when it hit social media, Donna Gephardt even chimed in on Twitter and spread that. So it was getting a lot of play all over. I wrote like a blog post for our website, just outlining the process, outlining why I thought the book should stay. I had to make sure that staff directed everything to me. The board did the same, so there was no confusion, there was no misunderstandings there. Well, it was time for the meeting in February, and the board had been well briefed of all of this from, I believe, the initial letter that I got. And so they knew kind of what was coming. We decided to hold that meeting in our regular meeting room. It's not nearly as big. And the board decided that they didn't need to hear any more comments from the public, that they had heard from people that wanted to speak to it. And we had received letters and emails leading up to the February board meeting. So the board, we had a meeting. There were a lot of people in attendance, including the same reporter. And then there was a newscaster who showed up at the end of the meeting. And the board voted 6-1 to retain the books. And it was sort of a big heavy weight lifted off of my shoulders. My hair was a darker color brown, and there was more of it before this. And one thing I've told Val is, man, I wish that I had written down how much time I'd spent on this project, because it was overwhelming. And things would happen in the middle of the night, and I'd get a text from a friend or something. And it took a lot of time. Well, it wasn't quite over. I was on vacation in the mountains of Colorado, and about halfway through my vacation, I was still checking email and stuff. And then I just decided, I need to just be present and stop. So I stopped. And when I got back, I'd found out that the woman that did the challenge went before the city council to complain about the process. She was particularly upset that she wasn't allowed to speak at the challenge. So then I had to talk to the city council. Our board president happened to be in attendance that night, so she was able to kind of brief them. And so then it was July of 2019, practically a year later, that I addressed the city council about our situation. And fortunately, we kept it to the policy. The discussion was only about the policy, not these individual books. And our board had gone over our policy. We made one minor adjustment. The reason why that the board didn't have that the challenger was to speak at the hearing with the original committee was wanted to remove emotions from it. You wanted to sort of make it a less emotional hearing. And that's the main reason why that was done. But that the woman then, used that against us as sort of stifling her voice. So I did have discussion with the city council then, and then finally, that was basically a year had passed. The one thing I did forget to mention is at our February meeting, we had we were picketed by the Westboro Baptist Church out of Topeka, Kansas. These are the God Hates Fags folks that you've probably heard of that picket funerals. They came to picket, and there were more police there than there were protesters. And they weren't allowed to block access to the library, but they had some signs. And it was, my mom told me, you're doing something right if you get picketed by the Westboro Baptist Church. So that it's true. But at one point during this whole process, I knew that this was the right thing to do. I knew that fighting this challenge was the right thing to do, and I knew I needed to do it as a professional. And I was willing to stake my career on it. I would have resigned had the board voted to get rid of the books, because I would have felt like I didn't do my job. But we put it behind us. One of the fears our board had was that we were going to just get swamped with more challenges, because those aren't the only books that feature transgender characters. You know, there's still books out there written for children that feature transgender characters, and I kept expecting, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we get another one, because that's what we're seeing nationwide. But our fear was that we would get overwhelmed by challenges, like just people trying to, you know, dominate our time and break us down. And that hasn't happened in our case, but the timing of this was really interesting, and the challenges just sort of skyrocketed. And each year since 2018, the number of challenges has increased. And the American Library Association Office of Intellectual Freedom, of course, monitors those. If you get one thing away from this presentation, is you need to have a good policy in place prior to receiving a challenge. And that's what allowed us to follow that. Is very helpful. It wasn't a new or distinct policy. We got a lot of it from other libraries, and including the ALA, but it was quite the ordeal. I think we came out stronger for it, but like I said, it took a lot of time, and it did wear me down quite a bit. But I'm pleased with how it turned out. But I fear that it's going to happen to maybe one of your libraries. And if anything I say could be helpful, and I'm glad we wrote a chapter for Val's book, it's more timely than ever. That's my experience, and we will take questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tom. I do see that Sean has joined us. Sean actually is coming to us, as I said, from Montana, but he was just presenting at the Montana Library Association similar symposium that we're having. So I'm so grateful that the timing worked out for Sean to join us. And Sean, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen in case you want to share something, or you can just begin your presentation.
Perfect. Well, unless anybody has strong feelings about it, I'm certainly comfortable with you just staring at my face while I talk to you. So like Val said, I'm Sean Anderson. I am the former assistant director at ImagineIF Libraries in Flathead County, Montana. And you know, I met Tom in preparing for this, and have talked to Valerie a number of times. And it is very striking to see the similarities between Tom's experience in particular and the experience that we had at ImagineIF Libraries. And I've not presented to another state conference about this topic. So it was eye-opening to be reminded that people in New Mexico or any distance from the state of Montana may not know about our situation, even though it's been very, very, very extensively covered by local news here. So Valerie made the good suggestion that I sort of give a rundown of our experience at ImagineIF. And I think it's just listening to Tom, I think it is interesting to just note the parallels along the way, and also notably where it sort of deviates from Tom's experience. So just a little bit about myself. I started at ImagineIF. It was my first, I worked in public libraries before. It was my first professional library position. I started as a senior librarian for collection development in 2014. And when I started at ImagineIF, I remember telling my wife after I interviewed that if I didn't get that job, I was going to have to find a new field to work in, because the culture and the mindset of ImagineIF was so progressive and creative and forward thinking and well supported by our sort of satellite organizations, that it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And I was super, super proud to join that team. And the all was sort of well and good, and I was learning a ton and, you know, growing professionally for a number of years there. And then in 2018 is sort of when things started to go off the deep end. One of our staff at a class visit read the book Prince and Knight to a group of students, which, if you're not familiar with Prince and Knight, is very standard, the most cookie cutter fairy tale story you could imagine, where you know, the princess gets captured by a dragon, so the brave knight has to go and slay the dragon and rescue the princess. The wrinkle in it is that it's a prince that needs to be rescued by the knight, and it is a same-sex fairy tale. And that sort of spun a small group of people in our community, which is admittedly a very highly conservative area in Northwest Montana. It suddenly brought the library into very stark focus for this group. And that we didn't receive challenges immediately following that, but what we did see starting in 2018 was the nature of our board appointments start to change. So we had increasingly conservative, increasingly less knowledgeable about libraries, increasingly increased opposition to the normal functions of libraries coming from this new breed of library trustee. And that was sort of a low grade smoldering that was happening until just, I want to say 20, I actually have the timeline down here. Starting in about 2020, we started to see, we received a challenge, a formal challenge to genderqueer. This was about 6 months following the departure of our library director, who resigned after, you know, just having a really, really negative experience working with this new board makeup for the last couple of years. She resigned and moved out of state. And then shortly after her departure is when we started to see these materials challenges roll in. So we got the challenges to both genderqueer and lawn boy in fall of 2021. And we followed our standard reconsideration policy. We had a recommendation made by our professional collection development staff, made that recommendation, gave it back to the board. And they, at that point, voted to retain lawn boy, but notably split their vote on genderqueer. Basically in a protest vote to say that they would retain it, but only under duress, because they felt that it was pornographic, but because of the policies and because of the stance on intellectual freedom that the library had placed on itself in policy, they felt they had no mechanism to actually make this decision without getting sued. So lawn boy was retained, but we technically genderqueer is still on the shelf, but it remains technically in limbo, where it has just been permanently tabled for discussion. So that was the experience with the book challenge. It was exhausting by itself. It very much mirrored the experience that Tom had, so I won't go through the details of that. But we also had this massive outpouring of negative response from the community. Obviously, when a materials challenge comes around, people come out of the woodwork to support their library. It's mind-blowing to see the number of people who normally don't care about the work that we do coming out in force when intellectual freedom is the topic. But in this scenario, I think because of the political nature of the materials that were challenged and not removed from the collection, we had a extraordinarily negative and borderline violent response to the library. We had people attend our board meetings staring me in the face as the assistant director and interim director, saying that they were the tip of the spear and they would do what it takes to defend their children and to defend their family, and that these types of deviant behaviors are not welcome in their community. And all of that culminated in August of last year when a number of the staff and myself were at the Montana Library Association conference to receive the Intellectual Freedom Award from the association. While we were out of town, we had a number of books dropped in our book drops that had been shot with 22 rounds and had bullet holes in them and still had slugs inside of the pages, which prompted library closure, prompted investigation by police. It happened a number of times in the subsequent days, and as you can imagine, just sort of put everybody on edge immediately. That, believe it or not, extended into hiring decisions, into the state library, into legislative issues as well. During this time, we had another director leave. Like I mentioned, I acted as interim director for a period of time. And the library board, in trying to fill that vacancy, selected a library director candidate that does not have MLS degree, which is required by state law to be eligible for state aid. And it's a very long story, but they did it sort of in defiance of that law. They knew what the consequences were. They were very aware of it. They were on record saying that they were going to make this decision anyway. And as a result, ImagineIF lost about $36,000 in direct funding from the state of Montana, as well as another several $1,000s from sort of our smaller federation group as well, because we no longer met the state standards for director qualification. So that was a hit locally, but that, now that we're in the legislative session, has morphed into our local legislators from Flathead County, the people that we serve, those legislators introducing bills to strip the funding that we use for hotspot access, to codify that library directors don't need any specific qualifications to do this job. They've submitted a raft of anti-obscenity bills, much like we've seen elsewhere. And it's really interesting being removed and paying attention to the legislature in this way, just how much these bills are being introduced and discussed and presented and amended purely out of spite. It's not hyperbole to say that. It is retribution for myself and library staff, as well as state library staff, our state librarian, taking a strong stance on topics of intellectual freedom, maintaining the legitimacy of our profession, and holding the line when that legitimacy is threatened. All of which I think is a very logical, rational response to what we've gone through. And the response from our legislators, our local legislators, has been to punish us for those stances. So that's my not so brief overview of what occurred with ImagineIF. I mentioned that I'm the former assistant director. I left that library in November after I was directed to no longer attend those board meetings. I was disinvited from those board meetings, and I made the decision that it was my voice and my presence was no longer moving the conversation forward. And so I made that decision to leave. It's been a very good and healthy decision, but one that comes with a lot of baggage. So I'm now very happy to tell this story and sort of share the experience, make myself available to people who may be experiencing the same thing, to sort of collaborate and share ideas on how best to respond. And like Tom said, answer whatever questions you might have on how to respond reactively or prepare proactively for when these challenges come home to where you are. Because I think the mindset needs to be, if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. I liked what Tom said about what a takeaway that you could take from his experience, and that's to make sure you have a solid collection development policy and a materials challenge policy. I think that's very, very sound advice. I could talk about that if there's interest. I think my takeaway is that the fundamentals that libraries are based on are strong, and they are universally held values that we had the most success in responding to these materials challenges and subsequent assaults on library policy and trying to strike language that promoted intellectual freedom in our policy. We had tremendous success by maintaining the focus on this traditional role of libraries to provide free and fair access to information to everybody in the community. That stood up incredibly well to accusations that we were leftist, that we were communists, that we were groomers, that we were pedophiles, that we were peddling pornography. It became very, very easy to defend those accusations, as disgusting as they were, by simply focusing on those core fundamentals of library service. And it turns out that by focusing on those, it produced this outpouring of support that it's just been mind-blowing to see just how universally held those beliefs are, because I think that they are, I operate with the assumption that the work that we do is enshrined in the Bill of Rights. These are constitutional rights that are under attack. And that if we maintain that focus on our most core fundamental role in the community, we maintain a much stronger position by that. That's hard. It means sort of keeping your mouth shut when you desperately want to speak. It means acknowledging that you may not be advocating for the people that you love the way that you might want to. But in the end, you are doing good, important work as a professional librarian. I have so much more to add. Like Val said, I've been at this conference and I've been in sessions talking about this very thing, and I feel like it's endless what I could share and advise and just commiserate about. So I guess on that, I can hand it off back to you, Val, or to anybody in the audience who has questions.
Sure. One of the things, instead of going back to my slides, I think both of your presentations really touch on some of the great advice. One is the policies, and the link that I've provided that accompanies our presentation, and I'll put it in the chat again, has information about policies, but in just a moment, Sean, I would love to hear how maybe there are some new ways that policies could be written to address some of these things. But one of the important things, and that I realized from your story that you haven't shared too much about, is the importance of the relationships you had with people outside of the library. And one of those really amazing relationships was with the press. And I feel like your story is a call to action for us all to make friends with reporters. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about that.
Sure. I think what I would say is I think you should maintain a healthy relationship with local reporters and maintain a healthy relationship with the press. I think that being too familiar with press and leaking things to the press and sharing internal documentation with the press is not the smartest idea. And I think my advice generally is to designate one individual person to talk to the press. I think it's most appropriate that that person be your library director, because he or she is appointed or hired specifically to represent the community. So in talking to the press, I think it is appropriate for that person to be the director, and having a single person playing that role helps you as the library control the messaging, have a common voice, have one singular person that you can comfortably point to and direct comments and questions to. I think that's my simplest advice. I think the other thing is that we are very fortunate in Flathead County to have an independent press. Oddly enough, it's the Flathead Beacon is owned by Maury Povich of Maury Povich fame. And God bless him, he knows how to put together a newsroom. They are truly, truly badass journalists that work at the Flathead Beacon. And we're super fortunate to have Micah covering these events as they happened. I think what I learned from working with the press and inviting the press to these things is that as much as we may not think it, and as much as we may assume that library business is boring business and board meetings are uninteresting, that is very much not the case. These materials challenges, these assaults on public servants and school districts and libraries, these are not news stories. There is a taste for these things in the public consciousness. These are unpopular actions that are being undertaken in our library boards and our school boards. So simply inviting the press to attend these public meetings and to cover them suits everybody very, very well. It shines a light in what is or is not happening in your boardroom, and it gets page views for the journalists. I mean, it's a very symbiotic relationship, as long as that is maintained in a healthy way, in a responsible way, and an ethical way. I'm by no means advocating for leaking things or to having a private relationship with the journalist, but have a relationship that is based on mutual trust and mutual respect, because it is important, and it was, like you said, critical to getting our story out there.
And along with the policies, one of the, besides collection development or a piece of collection development, should be a reconsideration policy. And for those of us who work in public institutions, our communities do have a right to let their opinions be known about material that they are displeased with. But there needs to be a policy in place for that reconsideration before an action starts to occur. So again, on that link, we have some information about reconsideration forms, and also having a process in place for how, once a library has decided we're going to retain these books, and the person once a library has purchased books and you have a complaint from somebody, it needs to be a formal complaint if one wants to go that far. And Tom, you talked a bit about the reconsideration policy, I think, that you had when you were dealing with this. And can you talk a little bit about how that was helpful?
Yeah, sure. It is helpful. Having a standard form, it asks some important questions, like, did you read the work in its entirety? Is there anything redeemable about the book? What alternatives would you recommend? And then they have to sign it, put their address on it and sign it. They have to be responsible, and we don't take anonymous challenges. And also for me, it was like, how did you find out about this book? You know, it's a little different, I would think, if it were a parent that'd come forward and say, hey, you know, my kid checked this out, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, listening to podcasts that are encouraging people to challenge books in their public libraries is a different matter. So those were all useful, but I would say, yeah, it needs to be formal. They have to be willing to sign their name to it. And you know, some people don't want that. They don't want to be accused of this, but they want the book on.
And I think one of the problems with current issues that are happening are that policies and procedures are being completely ignored. These activist groups are going around the library, are going directly to the press, are going directly to politicians. And so while these policies aren't the be all and end all that we would hope they would be, they're really important to have in place. So I would encourage your libraries, if you don't have these in place or they haven't been updated, to write them and or update them, and then make people aware that you have these policies. The person who oversees the library needs to know that they exist. That could be the mayor, that could be a board, it could be a dean. And these policies need to be in place no matter what kind of library you're working in, because these kind of activities are potentially coming for all of us, or they are coming for us, and we just need to be ready. As far as another book recommendation, I would make James LaRue has published a book called The New Inquisition, which is has a lot of stories in it from his own experience, and talks about really about how to listen to people and try to avoid having things escalate to the point where people want to formalize their complaints. So anyway, a great recommendation for a book, I think, is The New Inquisition for us as professionals looking for support. I guess we can open it up for questions. If there are people who have questions, I just wanted to acknowledge again, I did at the very beginning, that Rio Rancho has recently undergone a challenge as recently as last night, heard by the city council. And I see that there are some folks from Rio Rancho Public Library here. If you would like to share your experience or not at this point, that's fine. But I think your story is an example of what's happening in New Mexico, and hopefully the great response you had last night will put things to rest. But I don't know if that's a guarantee. So I'm going to just go with hands raised. Jason, do you want to speak?
Sure.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to. Thank you for doing this today and putting this on. It's extremely timely. So yes, last night at the City of Rio Rancho governing body meeting, a contingent came out requesting that the governing body ban books that had materials in them because they were pornographic. Speakers that were said in some form. We had kind of been given a little bit of a heads up about this. We didn't have a ton of time to prepare, but we did a little bit, and I was able to talk to my library board members at one and the community, and we had 28 people show up and speak last night against banning books. It was amazing, and you know, I had a rumor of this going on. Oh, I'm hearing that someone can't hardly hear me. I'm on my phone with this, so
it's better. Yeah.
If it's better if I
Yes.
zoom in. So you know, I had a rumor of this, but we didn't have any official notification of this action until Tuesday. So it really was 3 days where we could put out a request via the library board for people to show up. So within 3 days, we had all these people show up. The room was packed, mostly with library supporters. So 28 spoke. I don't know how many people were there in favor of the library, but over 50. And the 4 people that spoke, that asked for books being banned, were
we're really a quiet voice compared to the number of people supporting the library, which was amazing. When I pulled up to City Hall last night and walked in for the governing body meeting, there was a bunch of folks up front with a banner saying we're not going to ban books and support our libraries, and I got a little teary-eyed when I walked in. So but we didn't know what to expect, right? We were scared. We weren't sure what's going to happen. So it was awesome. It was amazing. I think it's the start of many more things to come. But it was good to know that the support is out there and that it could rally on a short notice. I would also say that I've had the complete and full support of city management. They've been adamant that we will not ban books in this city. I also realize it's a very privileged position and not every community has that level of support. Not every library does, but that's my little story from last night, hot off the presses.
Thank you, Jason. And reach out to NMLA should you need help. I hope you don't, but if you do and need support from the library community, we're here for you. Emily, you had your hand raised. You're still muted. Oh, I see that you're unmuting. We just can't hear you. I'll let you work on that for a second. If we hear you chime in, we'll go back for sure. Just keep your hand up. Lori, would you like to speak?
Thanks. I'm wondering if you know if there's any difference or if you have any statistics or evidence of how many of these challenges are coming in from inside groups, within your library service area, or from outside groups coming in to do book challenges, and if you think that has any impact on the outcome.
I can speak to Andover in that our challenges were from a resident.
I think, go ahead, Sean.
And that was our experience too. I've heard stories around the state of Montana that there are, calls coming from Texas from people complaining about something that's on our shelves. But I think by and large, it's happening from local residents. What is happening at sort of the national level or from outside of the local area is the influence. It's coming from podcasts, it's coming from Facebook groups, it's coming from these, Moms for Liberty is sort of the big banner group where a lot of this stuff sort of starts from. That seems to be their MO to start book challenge processes. And so I think they are activating and training and coordinating those efforts a little bit. So I think there's influence coming from all over the place, but the challenges themselves are local.
And I think that's what Rio Rancho has found. And just in keeping up with the news, it seems like it's national activist groups influencing local people to form local groups. So they are using information from national organizations and probably heavily funded organizations to speak to you locally as a local patron. Sue.
Okay. Yeah. My question is, I have a museum library. We deal with the space history and space race. How is any of this going to affect us if we start getting books that are biographies or autobiographies of those people who are members of the LGBTQ community who are astronauts and who are active in the space community, NASA community? We're not governed by a board. We're governed by the state of New Mexico, which means how can I do a policy? I'm going to have to refer to probably the States library group. I think this is a question that I am absolutely astonished we should even have to be discussing. Whatever happened to freedom of intellectual property? It's these people who are fighting us. They scream loud and long that their rights are being stomped on, but yet they have no qualms in squashing other people's rights.
Well, to answer,
What would you suggest that I would do?
yeah, I think a good starting point is having a collection development policy and describing what you're collecting and why and how it relates to the museum. I don't know what your administrative structure is exactly, like how that policy might be approved, but I'm sure the museum has a collection development policy, and this might be something that is in it and could be of help to you if there was a challenge to something you had, because you're collecting space things and
Exactly.
and this is a part of that. So but it's a good question, and I would encourage you to have a collection development policy even as a museum library. So
I created one when I got here 8 years ago.
okay,
And it's
great.
for the collections in general. I also revamped our library and archives use policy. I guess it needs some reworking yet again, and I can most certainly do that. I have not realized how endemic this is now becoming, how much like a cancer it's becoming in this country, with even Missouri wanting to ban closed libraries.
Oh, they
It's
did
like
it.
they want to promote ignorance. I'm sorry.
I appreciate all that, Sue. I think my advice, and this is where I put on my librarian hat and have to set the advocacy work aside. I think when it comes to writing policy, having it documented, it doesn't matter. It matters. I think it matters much less who it's approved by, as long as it's documented and you can point at people to it, and you can hang your hat on the fact that this is the document that you use to guide your selection decisions. That's step number one. I think be familiar with it so that you can answer those questions right away. And don't necessarily jump right to reworking it. I think this is neither here nor there. You can feel free to disagree with me. My personal stance on policy writing is make it as only as complicated as it needs to be. So I don't think you necessarily need to call out that you collect materials by LGBTQ authors. You simply collect books and materials about the space program. And if LGBTQ people happen to be a part of it, because they are, that certainly fits your policy. There's nothing that they can come at you for. It's documented, it's public knowledge, it is in use. Trust yourself.
Thank you. We collect the biographies and stories of our astronauts and their families and everything dealing with the space program. So what you just said is that's the blanket. That's what's in there now, and that covers it.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree, Sean. It's great to nuance that a little bit, and a collection development policy shouldn't necessarily point out the controversial things that you have. But some of those things will fall into it naturally, and that's where the defense comes. So I'm also putting in the chat a link to the selection and reconsideration policy toolkit that's been developed by ALA. It is a toolkit that has advice and sample policies for public schools, academic libraries, and school libraries. It's a project I worked on with some amazingly smart people. I learned so much from them. as you review this, if you want to talk to me about what you're doing, want me to review a policy and look it over so we can brainstorm and talk about it, please be in touch with me, and I'll put my email in the chat in just a moment. But Julia, would you like to speak?
I know there's no real good answer to this question, but I'm kind of wondering what Sean's take is on the new House bill in Montana, Bill 234, that is proposing to change the code to allow public school employees, public library employees, and museum employees to be charged up to $500 and 6 months of jail time if convicted of supplying obscene material to children. And the one legislator who said, I think there needs to be some book burning. So,
well, this is the critical moment where I acknowledge that I am participating in this conversation as a private citizen, and in no way is this connected to my role with the Montana State Library. I think, for what it's worth, and this may not be as widely known as it is here, that bill has basically been gutted to death. Pretty quickly, the restrictions or the application to public libraries was stripped because it's an invitation for gigantic lawsuits that are immediate losers. But even in the last week, that has also been amended to place schools and museums back into that exempt status, unless something has been deemed obscene by the courts. Then, you know, if they are still keeping it on their shelves, then there's grounds for that. But it's basically down to being a redundant bill that just repeats the obscenity law that already exists and has existed on the books for years and years. So wherever there's good news to be had, that's something I'm happy to share.
yeah, that is good news. I think I look at those more like, you know, when we used to talk about book banning as really it's a book challenge. But we are now reaching the point where we're going to have actual book bans, you know, legislated at us, and that part is, you know, kind of terrifying.
And I think it's an argument that I've made it's almost so simple that it gets complicated to discuss in practice, and that's that it is not the role of a library or a library trustee or even a legislature of a state, the United States Congress. It is not their responsibility. They do not have standing to define something as obscene. They do not. It is the court's job. And because it's the court's job, that's why we have these materials challenge processes. That's why a materials challenge is part and parcel of working in a library. It is something that we should expect and that we should be prepared for, because it is a test of intellectual freedom. It doesn't go to the courts unless these lower decisions get made, and then it gets pushed to the courts and a decision gets made. That's why you see so few books literally being banned and marked as obscene and removed from library shelves permanently. There's more often than not standing to appeal those decisions up through the courts. There is a process. It is going through the system. It is trusting the system, and it's utilizing the judicial system of the United States. Like, again, these are just fundamental cornerstone functions of American civic life that they're challenging. So I think I truly believe that they're doing it at their own detriment and to their own demise. And that's why I feel perfectly comfortable making as much noise as I want about these challenges, because it's un-American, and it's not something that I stand for. Like Tom, this is a hill I will die on every single time.
Thank you for sharing. I wanted to end today with some advice from Martha Hickson, who is a librarian in New Jersey. She was in a really large challenge. She's a school librarian, and I have links to her on the page that I've been sending the link out to, so you can hear about her story. But her challenge was really difficult. It was about Lomboy and genderqueer, which seem to be repeating titles today. And she had some words of advice, and they're words of advice we can all take now. So I wanted to share those with you. She said, do self-care now. Be good about taking care of yourself now. Get enough sleep, eat well, be healthy, because when the challenge comes, it's going to feel personal, and we need to be in the best position we can to deal with it. Know your policies, review your policies, understand how public meetings can work, and use the Public Meetings Act to your advantage if you need to limit people's ability to speak during meetings and require registration ahead of time, that kind of thing. Network, make sure that you keep in contact with librarians, and that's what NMLA is all about, right? Keep in touch with the state library, make friends, because you will need the support. And I think both Sean and Tom have talked about how important that is. Her other advice is don't do it alone. And that's why networking is so important. She had this great saying that they aren't working alone and you shouldn't work alone. This isn't about you. It feels very personal, but it's not about you. And so don't try to do this by yourself. And finally, her last piece of advice, which the Rio Rancho Public Library displayed beautifully last night, was readers are your leaders. They are the best support network for us, and letting them speak and defend you is the strongest voice we have. So knowing who those great community connections are for us is a really important aspect. And that's something we can be aware of, building those connections, making sure we can get in contact with people should we need to on short notice is really critical. So thank you today, Tom and Sean, so much for sharing your story. I know it was a difficult time and probably continues to affect you personally and professionally. And I want to thank the NMLA folks who have pulled this together today. I think there's nothing more important we can be talking about right now. And I'm grateful that we've been able to come together for this short time and share information. So thank you.
Thank you, Val. Go ahead. Stop.